Good morning, everyone. It is 10 o'clock, so we will get started. Today's webinar is titled From Evidence to Action, Agricultural Water Risk in Western Canada. This webinar focuses on study findings from the Alberta Digitalization Agriculture Program, funded by the Government of Alberta. My name is Roshan Sahota. I'm a project coordinator at the Simpson Center, and I will be moderating today. I am based in Calgary, located in the heart of southern Alberta. We would like to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta, including Nose Hill Métis District 5 and Elbow Métis District 6. Before I introduce today's speakers and panelists, here are a couple of quick housekeeping items. There is a box labeled Q&A where you can pose questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can click the thumbs up icon to move it to the front of the queue. We will also have a couple of poll questions for you throughout the webinar. Today's event will consist of presentations by our speakers, followed by question and answer sessions after each presentation. After the two presentations and the question and answer sessions, we will move on to a panel discussion. Finally, please be aware that this event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube and you will receive the link in an email as well as a post-event survey. We will also take clips from the video and post them on social media. We hope that today's event will promote discussion with diverse participants. Today, I am pleased to introduce two distinguished speakers. Both of them are experts in their respective fields. Following their presentations, they will conduct a Q&A session and a panel discussion to provide further clarity and answer your questions. Our first speaker is Dr. David Sauchyn, Director of Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative and Professor of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Regina. His research focuses on climate variability and its impacts on the natural resources of the Western prairies. Our second speaker is Matthew Lipieri, Project Manager and National Risk Management Lead at Farm Management Canada. Since joining the organization in 2010, Matthew has led projects developing risk management resources tailored for Canadian producers. His experience includes supporting producers in developing countries, teaching comprehensive agricultural risk management to hundreds of producers and farm advisors across Canada, delivering guest lectures at Canadian universities and colleges, and publishing a range of articles and papers. Welcome. Before we begin David's presentation, we have a poll question for the audience. The audience will have 30 seconds to respond to this question. So the question is, compared to the global average, at what rate has Canada's annual average temperature increased since 1948? So the poll will be open for 30 seconds. Okay, just to repeat the question, I think we have everyone almost answered. So to repeat the question, compared to the global average, at what rate has Canada's annual average temperature increased since 1948? And our results are 50% of participants answered at the same rate as the global average, 25% answered 1.5 times the global average, and 25% of participants responded twice the global average. And the correct answer is option 3, twice the global average. Thank you for participating in this poll. I will now invite David to start his presentation. As you listen to his presentation, please consider some questions you'd like to ask and put them in the Q&A box. In your questions, please tell us a little bit about yourself, including your location and profession. David, I'll pass it over to you. Sorry, David, you're muted.
How's that? Is that better?
Perfect, thank you.
Good, sorry about that. Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this forum. And I'll speak briefly about some evidence for agricultural water risk in Western Canada, framing it in terms of the standard classification of drought, which is according to the source and the type and use of water. So meteorological drought is a deficit of precipitation. Agricultural, a deficit of soil moisture. Hydrological, a deficit of surface water and groundwater. And sociological, the impacts of water deficits on the economy. And Matthew will speak to this in terms of programming and policy to deal with agricultural risk. So I'll present some data for each of these types, the first 3 types of drought, starting with precipitation. Note that the duration increases from left to right, so a precipitation deficit could be as short as a few weeks. After a few weeks without precipitation, it will be reflected in soil moisture levels. And if there's a duration of months in soil moisture, eventually it'll be reflected in groundwater and soil water levels. I will, precipitation data on the left, we have a Government of Alberta weather station where precipitation is measured. Also, soil moisture is monitored, and we use that data quite extensively. In the background, up on that plateau, up on that mesa, there are very old limber pine trees as seen on the right, and we use tree rings from these dry sites as a proxy of soil moisture, because what limits tree growth at these sites is the availability of soil moisture. So we have a 1,000 years of soil moisture data. This is on Piikani land, so we depend very much on the generous cooperation of the Piikani First Nation. So that's precipitation and soil moisture. And then we also have modeled data. This is a climate model which we have been running for the Western Prairies at a scale of 10 kilometers. And then for a smaller area on a 3-kilometer grid, we've been running this model for Southern Alberta and generating a lot of data. You can see the resolution of the data. That image on the left, the boundary of the city of Calgary. And so we have historical and future climate data for a large number of variables at the scale of neighborhoods within the city of Calgary, but in rural areas, it's at a sub-township scale. And the running of this model was enabled by support from MMAX, NSERC, and a supercomputer from the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. Therefore, at PARC, we have a very large quantity of instrumental, proxy, and modeled precipitation, soil moisture, and runoff, so much so that we have 2 96 terabyte network attached storage devices. So we're in combined, they represent the capacity to store 192 terabytes of data, and we are reaching the capacity of these storage devices. So let's just tap into this database and extract a little bit of data. Here's some instrumental data. So this is measured precipitation on an annual basis at Lethbridge in the lower left and Swift Current in the upper right. The Swift Current record goes back to 1886, but there's a few missing years in the 1930s. The Lethbridge record since 1920 is continuous. Couple of things to note: low precipitation levels over the last decade. But we can't necessarily attribute this to climate change because, as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of variability from year to year and from decade to decade. And by definition, climate change is a prolonged period of a departure from normal conditions, and 10 years is not a prolonged period. So that's a precipitation record that's characterized by so much variability. Soil moisture. This is the soil moisture record from that station that I showed you in the previous photograph at Brockett. And it's a fantastic measure of soil moisture. The problem is that these soil moisture stations have only been established since the mid-2000s, so these records are relatively short. Although the thing to note is that soil moisture is measured at 4 depths. And at the greatest depth, 1/10 of a meter, soil moisture approaches 40%, and it's relatively consistent. So the week-to-week and month-to-month variability that's evident at the shallower depths is muted at the greater depth, so that at the depth of 100 centimeters, we see primarily seasonal variability, but also note the downward trend since about 2018. And that's concerning because it indicates that there's been a sufficient water deficit over the past 10 years that it's now reflected in the storage of water at depth in the soil. So this is a fantastic soil moisture record, but like I said, relatively short. Here is a much longer record of runoff. This is the flow of the South Saskatchewan River measured at Medicine Hat back to 1913. The measured flow is in brown. Note how since the 1950s, there's been a consistent downward trend in stream flow. This is the result of the consumptive use of water for irrigation and by municipalities. It also reflects the decline in the storage of ice and snow at high elevations in the headwaters of these rivers. Now, hydrologists at Alberta Environment have naturalized the flow. They've put the water that's been consumed and diverted, they put it back into the hydrometric record. So the naturalized flow is in blue. It's not declining as steeply, but it's still declining as a result of, once again, the change in glacier mass balance and snow mass balance at high elevations in the headwater basins. But once again, tremendous amount of year-to-year variability, but also decadal variability, whereby there are entire decades or even up to 2 decades of consistently higher or lower flow, which makes it difficult to draw any kind of conclusions about the impact of climate change because the trends, in this case, a downward trend since the 1950s, is obscured by the variability, the natural variability. So I've showed you precipitation data, soil moisture data, and runoff data or stream flow data. And here they are shown in the context of the hydrological cycle. But the hydrological cycle also includes trees. Trees are part of the hydrological cycle. And the growth of these trees is limited by water if the trees are growing in a subhumid environment like ours. And so we can actually infer precipitation, soil moisture, and runoff from the growth of these trees. We've been doing this for decades. We've collected old wood at every one of those green pins. Most of our collecting is on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains because that's where most of our water comes from. Most of the industry and people in Alberta and Saskatchewan derive their water from eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. But also we did most of our collecting at these sites because this is where we find the oldest trees. We found wood that cross dates to the year 542. So in fact, we have almost 1,500 years of soil moisture data. Here's one of our better sites. This is south of Calgary near Longview. This is in the whalebacks on the Walden Ranch, where we find very old living and dead limber pine and Douglas fir. And in our lab, we precisely measure the seasonal tree growth because each tree ring consists of the early growth, the lighter color, the dark growth, the darker color. And because we've been able to automate the detection and measurement and cross-stating of the tree rings, almost automate, we still need these research assistants to ensure that the algorithms are working properly. We now have close to 4.8 million measurements from 5,266 trees. And so we've begun to use machine learning to analyze this huge database of proxy soil moisture going back 1,000 years. And here is one of our reconstructions. This is of drought in the South Saskatchewan River Basin over the past 900 years. We have classified the severity of drought in terms of the cumulative deficit in runoff. 5 categories of drought from benign, number 1, to extreme, number 5. And if we look at the colors in red and brown, you'll see the 1930s and early 40s show up. But the most sustained and severe drought of the past 900 years was in the mid-19th century, 1840s to 1860s, which is when John Palliser came through with his expedition and said a large area will remain forever comparatively useless. He was referring to southern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan. And when Medicine Hat was established, in the very first edition of the Medicine Hat newspaper, there was an editorial that said it was almost criminal to have brought settlers to this area to farm. Well, the settlers came. So there's a settler, and I know the quarter section. I know the month because that's my grandfather homesteading in southern Alberta. If we skip forward several generations, his grandson, I'm director of the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative, and for 25 years, we've been doing science-based research on climate change and adaptation. Park was established initially by the federal government, and they chose Regina as its location to be in close proximity to the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. PFRA was a government agency that was created to rehabilitate prairie farming after the drought of the 1930s. So it was an institutional adaptation to climate change. Here is an indication that the climate of the world is changing. This is the average temperature of the whole world every month back to January 1880. The warmer months are in red, the cooler months are in blue. And note that since the 1970s, every single month, with one tiny exception, has been warmer than average, so that now the world is about 1.4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, and Canada is warming at twice that rate. So this is pretty convincing evidence of a warmer climate, but keep in mind that there is no average temperature of the whole world. That's just a statistic, and the world doesn't have a single climate. So we're concerned about what is happening where we live. And here's the strongest indication from the prairies that our climate is warming. This is an increase in the daily average winter minimum temperature. Nighttime temperatures are rising in winter quite a bit. At Red Deer, an increase of more than 4 degrees, which is huge. That's the upward trend in red. At Lloydminster, the same variable, but now using vertical bars. The longer the vertical bar, the colder is the winter. And I've just shown minus 20 for sake of argument. If you follow that horizontal line up to the 1990s, there's only been 2 winters since the 1990s where the temperature on average has exceeded minus 20 as a minimum. So the fact is our winters are quite a bit warmer. You can think in terms of the implications of that, in terms of the snowpack, the overwinter snowpack, snowmelt in the spring, earlier snowmelt in the spring. So we are losing the advantage of our cold winter in terms of our major water supply, which is snow. But if winter is getting warmer and shorter, it means the growing season is getting longer. And this is our projection using climate models of how much more our winter will warm. And this is when the whole world has warmed by 2 degrees, then minimum temperatures in southwestern Alberta will only be about 2 degrees warmer, because after all, southwestern Alberta is almost much warmer than the rest of the prairies in winter. But as you go north and east, the winters get progressively warmer into the future until northern Manitoba. The minimum temperature could be up to almost 7 degrees warmer in the near future, which is hard to imagine. So this is from a model. We take this model data. This is on a grid, 10-kilometer grid. So in fact, it represents thousands of projections of the future climate. We take the climate data, we drive models, and so we have simulations of soil moisture and crop yield on a 10-kilometer grid across the Prairie provinces. But I haven't got time to talk about that. I'm going to come back and just point out that if winter is getting warmer and shorter, the growing season is getting longer. And so this is the length of the frost-free season at 3 locations on the prairies, an upward trend. And this increase in the length of the frost-free season might account for some of the increase in crop yield. This is crop yield, spring wheat, canola. This is in Saskatchewan. But the same thing is happening across the prairies. Yields are going up. And to a large extent, it's probably farming practices. But the fact is that there are more growing degree days as the climate warms. However, note that in some years, there are low yields and crop losses because there's only so much productivity in years in which water is lacking. So those years, for example, are 2021, 2002, 2003, 1988, 1984, 1961 was a wicked drought. Drought has and will always limit productivity on the prairies, although there's some good news, and this is, so far it's anecdotal, but producers have been telling us, have been telling the Western producer that despite the excessive moisture and moisture deficits of recent years, they're still able to produce crops. And this is a reflection of a adaptation of farming practices to the extremes of moisture. And as a result, you no longer see, and here's the kind of farming practices we're talking about: maintaining a permanent cover and farming practices to enhance soil carbon, soil moisture. And as a result, we don't see scenes like this anymore. When was the last time you saw a dust cloud like this? Well, I remember in the 1980s. But despite the droughts of the 21st century, this kind of soil drifting and a dust storm seems to be a thing of the past, with the exception of a few local fields. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by saying that this scientific framework, this scientific evidence is being used to some extent. For example, the City of Calgary recently released drought resilience plan features tree rings on the cover and throughout because they're using our tree ring record of drought. And our work on reconstructing prairie drought is also featured in magazines like The Furrow and Canadian Cowboy Country. But despite the amount of adaptation in farming practices to deal with drought, we are still faced with a worst case scenario of when we get a drought of a decade in duration, which has happened, but it will occur in a warmer climate in the future. So I'll conclude with that. Thanks.
So we do have one question from an anonymous attendee who is asking, why is Canada warming at twice the global average rate?
I'm trying to think of a short answer. A lot of reasons, but in general, at the higher latitudes, and the climate warming is being driven by a change in the concentration of greenhouse gases, which is a global phenomenon. But there are a lot of feedbacks whereby if you warm the climate, you reduce the snow cover, and snow cover has high albedo. It tends to reflect the incoming radiation. So by reducing snow cover, we are changing the energy balance whereby more heat is being retained by the land. That's just one of the feedbacks, but just in general, and we already discussed how Canada's warming at twice the rate. Well, the Arctic is warming at 3 to 4 times that rate. So it's kind of simplistic to say a country the size of Canada is warming at X rate. It varies a lot from region to region, with the Arctic warming the fastest.
Thank you for that answer. We have one more question at this time. Do the data suggest that we can still rely on historical baselines for planning, or are we entering a period where past patterns are less predictive?
Well, the natural variability is not going away, but it's being modified. So we have to know how those natural cycles will evolve, or what they will look like under warmer conditions. And that's the key to projecting the future frequency and duration of drought, is how can we combine a record of natural variability, such as the tree rings, with projections from climate models to get a sense of what is the risk that we face from extremes of moisture.
Thank you so much for that answer, David. This was such an engaging session. If you have further questions for David, please continue to put them in the Q&A box, and we will continue to cover them during the panel discussion. For now, we're going to move on to Matthew's presentation. And before we get started, I'm going to share a second quick poll with the audience. So this poll question is, compared to 2018, how much did crop insurance payments in Canada increase for the severe drought years of 2021 to 2022? So the choices are they doubled, they increased by more than 3 times, or they increased by more than 5 times. So this poll question will be open for 30 seconds. Okay. I'm going to end the poll here, and we will actually leave this answer hanging, and you may learn the answer from Matthew's presentation here. And as Matthew is presenting, please be sure to continue putting your questions into the Q&A box so Matthew can address them at the end of the presentation. I'll pass it over to Matthew.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I'll try to address that question a little bit later on in the presentation. So I was asked today to examine another side of dealing with water risk and and drought. So it's more on the business risk management architecture side, in particular regarding the different BRM programs that are available currently to manage that type of risk. So I'll start just with a quick plug for Farm Management Canada, which is where I work. We are an organization that was actually funded or founded in crisis back in 1992, so following the 1980s crisis, which was more of a financial crisis than an environmental crisis at that point. But the idea was to be able to enable farmers to manage risk, manage their business in a more effective way by creating tools and resources and information for them, and to having someone there to sort of fight for their needs and be able to provide some of the resources that are critical to managing a business these days, or managing a farm business. So we're a not-for-profit organization. We're a neutral organization, and really we are involved in quite a few risk management initiatives, including the risk management working group that's currently being undertaken by the Canadian Ag Policy Institute. We're participating in one of the BRM reviews with the Canadian government, which is going through the audits committee. We're participating in various discussions on risk management throughout Canada, and present webinars on this topic as well. So we try to be as involved as possible, and we also provide training on comprehensive risk management in agriculture throughout the country, and we've done that for many years now. And we've developed tools and resources online as well for comprehensive risk management. But today's focus is going to be more specifically about the business risk management suite, which is really the programs that are offered by the Canadian government across Canada, and that enable farmers to manage some of these risks. So there's really four key components to the business risk management suite in Canada that's available throughout Canada. And there's some variations from province to province. Some programs are available just provincially, but these are available throughout the country. So there's on the one hand, the one that people know the most, I think, would be Agri Insurance, which is commonly known as crop insurance in Western provinces. And it's basically an insurance product that stabilizes farm income. And it's targeted towards primary production losses. So it's about yields, it's about how much production is happening in the fields, and it really only covers crops. We have Agri Stability as well, which is a whole farm insurance product which covers most of agriculture. There's a few very small exceptions, but it's a program that is meant to provide a financial safety net, and it covers the farm's margin based on their own data as well. Then we have Agri Invest, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail on these as we go along, but we have Agri Invest, which is really meant for small income declines. It's a self-managed savings account where the government will match contributions to that account. And then finally, there's Agri Recovery, which is not a program per se, it's a framework, but it's there to intervene in the event of extraordinary costs that are incurred during natural disasters. So it's really, what's not being covered by these other programs, and that are extraordinary costs, and that sometimes Agri Recovery will be brought in to cover those situations, including in some cases, and we'll see that it has covered some extraordinary expenses that were related to drought. So there are other government programs in Western Canada within each province to help manage water risk or drought risk, but we're not going to go into much detail on those today. Agri Invest. So overall, it's like I said, a self-managed producer governed savings account. Essentially, the government looks at your annual net sales, calculates 1% of that with a minimum of $250 and a maximum of $10,000 being the 1%. And they match that in an account that is created for that purpose. So It may seem like a small amount. There's actually quite a bit of money in these accounts right now. If you look across Canada, I think the last figure I saw was around the 2 billion mark. So there's a lot of money there right now. So this is really meant to be a rainy day fund. So you keep some money aside to manage some cash flow issues or some small losses that can occur over time. And then we have Agri Stability, which is one of the main ones, which, like I said, covers all kinds of risk and all kinds of farms. It's a whole farm margin program. So what it covers is actually your own reference margin. And I'll go into how that's calculated. But whenever that reference margin drops by 30%, used to be 15%, now it's 30% drop. So the coverage is at 70% of your actual margin. So when it does drop below that, the program will pay, depending on the year, anywhere between 70 and 90% of that loss. So the right now it's actually been pushed up to 90% since 2025, or that's when it was announced. And then they've also pushed up the maximum that can be covered from 3 million to 6 million. So yeah, and the premiums in this case, and I just want to highlight this because it's sort of important in regards to drought risk. The premiums don't really vary. It's about $315 per $100,000 of margin covered. There's a small admin fee. I think it's $55. So yeah, it's a fairly cheap program, and the cost does not vary depending on the amount of claims that you've had or that sort of thing. So it's really meant to cover your margin. How does that work? It's based on an Olympic average. So let's say we take 5 years, and it takes 5 years of your previous margins, and then it eliminates the top one and the bottom one, leaving the middle three. So these are your margins. Margins are based on your allowable revenue versus your allowable costs. And that will be your margin. They have a set of different things that are available through the program as allowable expenses and allowable revenue. And I won't get into a ton of detail on that because we'd be here for a long time. But essentially, once that's calculated, that's your margin for the year. So you calculate your 5 years of margins, take the middle three. So the top one is eliminated, the bottom one's eliminated. That's your reference margin. So that's the average of those 3 middle years. And then that gives you your program year margin. So let's say you have a loss. Here we have a significant loss that's gone, that's brought your margin much lower than it usually would be according to that average. Then we have tier 2, which is covered. That's the part that you'll be paid. And tier 1, which is the part that will not be paid. It's that 30% drop. And then within that you have, so within tier 2, 90% of the cost there is covered by the program, and the other 10% is a producer expense. So that's your producer's share. And the loss, of course, being that 30% drop that has to be incurred before it actually kicks in. So it's a bit of a complex calculation. But overall, what it essentially means is it will cover your margin based on your own historical data, based on your own farm's production and it's the entire farm, it's a whole farm coverage over the past 5 years. And we'll see how a longer term drought or water shortages can affect that in a more prolonged drought sort of perspective. Now, finally, we have Agri Insurance. I'm not going to go into Agri Recovery really because it's not the same from year to year. It really depends on what's needed at what time. But Agri Insurance, or your crop insurance, is a production loss-based insurance, and it covers your yields based on a historic average, which is 10 years if it's for your individual farm, or 15 in some cases when it's for a sort of a regional coverage. So usually 10 years for your own farm, 10 years of yields. They take the average there. And again, this is going to be important as we go forward as far as how a drought or prolonged drought could be covered. And then your coverage level will vary. It's really up to the individual producer to pick which coverage level they want. Of course, the rates will be based on that. Or the premiums, should I say, based on whatever rate you decide or coverage level you decide to take. And after that, your indemnity or what you'll get paid is based on whatever your guaranteed production was minus your actual production that year times the insurance price, and that insurance price is set by your provincial administration, or in some provinces set by the federal administration. So yeah, it's essentially an excellent coverage for crops, really based on your own again historical yields. It links to Agri Stability as well through the fact that if you get a payment from crop insurance, it will be deducted from your Agri Stability payment. And those payments also count as income in calculating a reference margin for previous years. So if you did receive money from crop insurance in the past, then that will kick up your Agri Stability in previous years because it's considered revenue for those years. So it helps to build up your margin. And in the current year, of course, if you got paid by crop insurance, you won't get paid twice through Agri Stability, but they will sometimes top it up depending on what that did to your margins. And then eventually, also it links to Agri Invest because your annual net sales include any crop insurance payments that you might have done. So when they calculate 1% of your annual net sales, that includes any payment you got from crop insurance as well. So essentially, all these programs are linked together. They try to build a framework. This is how your drought would be covered through these programs. So you would have Agri Insurance that would cover any yield losses or production losses and pay you through that. Agri Stability that would offer margin support if your margins went down. Of course, the two are linked, as I said, and it captures any income losses that you may have had as well. Then there's Agri Invest that helps you as a bit of a liquidity buffer. It just basically, if you're able to invest a little bit of money, the government will match that, and it will help you to get through some of those harder periods. And then there's Agri Recovery that will kick in whenever we have extraordinary recovery costs. For example, feed or hauling impacts that are not covered through Agri Insurance or Agri Stability. So those are really activated on a case-by-case basis. What would happen in the event of prolonged water shortages? And based on David's presentation, I mean, that could happen throughout different periods, or has happened throughout different periods of history. And we seem to be sort of in that sort of phase at the moment. So, but regardless, if this were to happen, what would happen to Agri Stability? Well, one negative effect would be, because we're looking at margins that are from previous years. If you have multiple consecutive years where you had lower margins because you weren't able to produce as well as you normally would, then or your costs increase if you're if you're in cattle and you had to buy feed at a much higher cost and your margins went down in a consistent way, then your reference margin will be lower, which means your coverage will be lower in future years as well. Same thing would apply to your payment amounts. Obviously, the more your reference margin goes down, the lower your payments are going to be in future years, even if you do have an event that causes you to have a lower margin. So overall, not a great effect if we're looking at a long-term type of water event where we have long-term drought. There have been some recent developments that are trying to compensate for the current risk environment. So we have increased responsiveness, and by that I mean we went up over the past few years, actually, we've gone up from 70% coverage to 90% coverage in the compensation rate. So that's in order to help alleviate some of that risk stress that's been happening throughout Canada. Then we have inventory valuation changes that have happened a little bit. So there have been adjustments to rising feed because of rising feed prices, so that they don't offset declining feed inventory. And then there's been, well, interim payments have been around for a while, but so I shouldn't call it a recent development, but that's available as well. If you see you're having a really bad year, you could apply for an interim payment in advance in order to get that compensation a little bit earlier and avoid, some of the cash flow issues that might result of having a bad year. Crop insurance, what would happen with the effects of prolonged water shortages as well? Well, the one thing, of course, is at first you may have some high payouts. There's been some good years, and all of a sudden you hit a bad year. And we'll talk about a 2021 example very shortly. But essentially, you'll have a high payment year, but then afterwards, that will affect premiums in the following seasons because now the cost of that insurance has gone up dramatically. So the other thing that will happen is eventually, if you have a prolonged drop in yields, well, that will affect your historic yields and that affects your coverage. So it means your coverage will be lower when you're looking at your average yields over the past 10 years. And then the one thing a few things that have happened in recent developments to sort of help, and I'm talking here more about Alberta as examples, but they've adjusted some of what they call normal moisture levels for 2026 to reflect some more drier realities. And then the same thing for salvage value. They've increased the low yield allowance, which allows farmers to salvage some drought-stricken crops for livestock feed rather than just destroying them. So there are adjustments happening because of the drought situations that have occurred. But again, in the event of prolonged water shortages, we could have some issues in the future. So, and then finally, agri recovery. Well, what effect would that have if we had prolonged water shortages? Well, essentially, again, agri recovery is really meant to be intervening when there are exceptional circumstances. So prolonged drought doesn't really fall under that category. It's not intended to cover that kind of recurring disaster event. And the more recurring it is, the less it sort of falls under that agri recovery umbrella. So if it becomes more common to have droughts or more severe droughts or more prolonged droughts, then that will in fact decrease the intervention of agri recovery. So if we look at an example of the 2021 drought and how the BRM program sort of intervened, and this is where I'll answer the question to the poll. Maybe we could post up the results of the poll just to see what people said before I get to that. But you could see there, oh, there we go. So we have, I think most of you got it right. So 42% got the right answer. They increased by more than 5 times. So yeah, you can see the insurance payouts that happened in 2021 once the yield losses triggered some claims. And we're looking at about across Canada throughout all the programs, about 6 billion. I think just 2 billion or so was in Alberta alone and another 2 billion in Saskatchewan. So actually a bit more than that if you count the other programs. So a huge impact in that year. And then Agri Recovery supports also kicked in to help with some of the extraordinary costs that were sort of offshoots of that drought as well. So it does show that we have production insurance that was there to cover that type of drought, but in a 1-year event. What that means, though, going forward is if there are more and more frequent droughts or multi-year droughts, then this system is really built on the assumption that we have, once in a while we have a severe drought, and that's when these programs kick in, not so much when these programs become or these droughts become recurring. So how this can fall short as drought risk evolves is if it's first of all it's backward looking pricing. So that's a bit of an issue because we're looking at historical data. And that means that, if this happens again recurringly, then that historical data will disadvantage the reaction that we'll see. So if we're talking about multi-year structural drought, that's just not what our BRM systems are designed for. So structural drought will actually decrease coverage over time and increase premiums in the case of crop insurance. And then we have, the limitations to disaster response as well through the Agri Recovery program, which could be an issue over time as well, because it's really not designed for that either. We put out a report with the Canadian Ag Policy Institute a few years ago. Sorry, not a few years ago, last year. We talked about striking the balance between proactive risk management versus reactive. And what we mean by proactive risk management is essentially what you can do on a farm to improve your resilience and to adapt your farm to the risks around you. So the first line of defense in our mind is the farmer when it comes to these types of risks. As much as the BRM suite is important as a safety net, there's a need to reduce some of the dependency on those reactive responses. So it looks beyond sort of traditional business risk management programs, and it embraces sort of the idea that we have to be more proactive and in adapting our risk management. And I think, as David outlined, we're seeing a lot of that. If you're looking at permanent crop cover for cover crops for ground and avoiding some of that severe drought effect and keeping some of that moisture in the ground already, those are the types of adaptive measures that I think are going to be important as we go forward. So really, when we're looking at risk management in a future context and even adapting some of the BRM programs, we want to keep in mind, on the one hand, that there are government BRM programs that serve a purpose and that are there to mitigate the negative impacts and cope with negative outcomes. So sort of to repair the damage versus what we can do proactively, which is to help to reduce some of those risks and adapt to things like drier conditions. So, and here's some ideas as far as how we could do some of the shifts in current program design in order to adapt to a drier condition environment where we would have prolonged droughts. So, looking more at forward signals, using some of that data that we have, as David presented, to help to build some of those programs, maybe create multi-year coverage features. And one of the big complaints we get out of the programs is that it takes too long to get payments. So that is something that could be addressed as well going forward. On the other hand, I think the key here, and it says at the bottom of my slide, is that our main shift should be from, going from paying after there's been a loss to reducing the vulnerability. So it's more about adapting and becoming more resilient. And that as well could become part of the BRM suite offered by our government. So there could be benefits and incentives for water smart practices. There could be incentives and support to shift to towards more drought resistance farming practices. Data sharing will be really important as well, just to ensure that we have some good benchmarking and forward-looking tools. And then finally, just remembering that there are clear roles for these two types of programs. On the one hand, we have our BRM that's there as a financial backstop and a safety net. And on the other hand, we have risk management that is there to reduce our exposure and impact. So we came up through the the proactive risk management or the striking the balance report with some recommendations for different groups, and it kind of ties back to what I just said. On the one hand, really look at a proactive risk management lens when it comes to building policy, harmonizing farm data, and reevaluating some of the programs to make sure that they're meeting the industry needs as we go forward in the current context and current reality. And then incentivizing proactive planning and support extension. So those are key roles, I think, that can be adopted for some of the BRM programs and some of the government supports that are out there. And from an educator, association, or producer group perspective, I think it will be important going forward to normalize proactive and comprehensive risk management planning. So looking at adaptation and resilience over how BRM could help to bail us out, and providing risk management that's focused on educational opportunities, and creating support groups as well, advisory support and coaching to help to be able to implement some of those adaptation measures as well. So what to remember out of the presentation today, and I'm sorry for going through that so quickly, but here, so we currently our drought risk is primarily managed through BRM outcomes, although we are seeing adaptive measures now to make sure that we're keeping some of that moisture in the soil. So that the four main programs, again, being Agri Insurance, Agri Stability, Agri Invest, and Agri Recovery. That suite of programs really does work well for short-term shocks, but not so much for long-term or prolonged type of events as a prolonged water shortage would do. There are some modernization opportunities, including big data, remote sensing, climate-informed models to keep the coverage affordable and reflective of risk going forward. And the highest value really comes from aligning risk programs with proactive resilience. So it's important to keep that perspective in mind. Again, the farmer is that first line of defense, and it's really important that adaptation become a big part of the way we're going to face some of these upcoming risks. So that is all for me.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that excellent presentation. It was very informative. We have time for one quick question before we get into our panel discussion. This question is from Mark Redmond. In Western Canada, we have a lot of cattle and pasture. Why do the BRM programs not offer better protection for our ranchers?
Okay. Well, I think that is changing, and we're seeing some adaptations just recently. I think about 7 days ago, there was an adaptation to the Agri Stability program to include pasture costs, so renting pasture from neighbors as part of the allowable costs within the program. So I think there are some changes happening. I couldn't tell you why exactly the BRM programs were designed the way they are. I think when you look at crop insurance and that sort of thing, it really is directed towards grains and oilseeds. We have less of that happening for ranchers for sure. But some of the programs that are there, like Agri Stability, are designed for all types of farms. So definitely, I think there's room for growth. One of the things we keep talking about when we look at a bit of a review of the BRM programs is how we could better adapt the BRM programs to the different situations and the different types of commodity groups that are out there that maybe are less well protected than others, and for which maybe the programs don't work quite as well. So that's something I think that is being discussed, but already you're seeing some of those changes come into play. And again, I would direct you to some of the changes that just happened in Agri Stability. And I don't have much information about that, but it is progressing. So.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you for this informative session. I think I'll now invite David to return to the screen and we'll get into our panel discussion. To start off, we have a question for David from Shannon Frank. The question is, will climate change impact our ability to fill our many reservoirs? How will irrigation be impacted?
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for that great question. Certainly, I mean, drought is a natural phenomenon. It's not caused by climate change, but it's occurring in a warming climate. So excuse me, as the winter gets warm, we can expect the snowmelt runoff to occur earlier in the year. And therefore, the warm season, the warm half of the year in our part of the world will be warmer and longer. And so that towards the end of the summer, there will tend to be drier conditions because with a longer frost-free season, we'll have more days of net positive water loss by evaporation. So there's certainly, and we already know what happens, for example, in 2021 when there is a insufficient runoff to fill, for example, the Old Man Reservoir. And we can expect this to reoccur with the kinds of impacts we saw in previous years.
Thank you so much for that response. We have another question here. How should responsibility for managing system drought risks be balanced between producers, insurers, and governments as client pressures intensify? So I think I'll turn that over to Matthew to answer that question.
Give me the good questions. Yeah, that's a tough one. Balancing things out is really the key here. And I think we always have to remember that the business risk management suite was designed as a safety net. And that's what it's meant to be. Is it going to react well to sort of if in the event of a prolonged drought, is it going to react well? Well, I think there's certainly some room to adapt at that point, because currently, as I mentioned throughout my presentation, it will there'll certainly be decreasing returns in that sense. From at the same time, I don't think there's any rancher or farmer out there that wants to be supported year after year strictly through BRM programs. So, adapting to and adapting and becoming more resilient to these types of events, I think will be a key that will allow producers to continue to work within that environment and to continue to thrive throughout. A BRM program is not going to make you whole 100%. You're not going to make as much profit as you would if you were doing well that year. So I think the key is really to have governments encourage some of those adaptive measures and those resilience measures so that farmers can continue to thrive and continue to be successful and adopt the right practices to put it on to enable to go forward. So yeah, it is a balance. I think farmers want to look out for themselves for sure. You can't put everything on insurance programs, but at the same time, I think there could be more encouragement down that road as well.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We have a question directed to both speakers. So David, maybe we'll start with you and then Matthew can jump in as well. The question is from Juhi. So in Dr. Sauchyn's presentation, he mentioned a 2025 Western Producer article about how Canadian farmers are producing record crops despite the droughts and floods, which seems to imply that there isn't as much of a negative impact of those extreme events. The second presentation showed how payouts are increasing due to yield losses. There seems to be a disconnect here. How are both scenarios possible? So David, maybe you could speak a little bit to that to begin with.
That's an excellent point, and I have my own opinion that's informed mainly by talking to producers. And when you read these articles about how a producer is able to maintain production despite drought, it tends to be those who are adopting certain practices to maintain soil moisture, soil health, and so on. So, and this is just an observation I made by talking with lots of producers, that there is a different schools of thought in the ag community about how practical it is to implement some of these measures like cover crops and intercropping and to ensure that there will be some type of crop under dry conditions, but at the expense of implementing these less conventional approaches. And perhaps Matthew has an opinion on that as well in terms of and I find that the ag community is incredibly diverse. It's much more diverse than people in the city. I mean, compared to my community in Regina, people are pretty much all the same. I get out in the ag sector, and people have such different opinions about how they can deal with how they can manage their production to deal with the volatility in the climate.
I think, yeah, the only thing I agree with you completely, David, but I think the only thing I would potentially add to that is, well, on the one hand, the 2021 year was a bit of an exceptional year when it came to drought. So when we talk about the increased payouts there, it was a one-time thing for that year, which most of the payouts occurred in 2022. So I'm not saying that's the general trend necessarily. What I think I was trying to outline through the presentation is, in the event of prolonged droughts where a large area would be affected, and we did see decreasing yields, and then the BRM programs might have some issues on that respect. But I think the other thing that might have sort of if there was in fact increased claims over the past few years, as we've seen other things that have affected, we're talking about drought today, we're talking about water shortages, and maybe the yields have been good. It doesn't mean that the prices that people have gotten for their production have been great either. So there's that other factor that ties into the BRM programs, which don't just cover production losses. I mean, crop insurance, yes, but not Agri Stability, for example. That's really looking at covering margins. So it's possible we could potentially see increased claims and increased production at the same time, just because of the fact that input costs are going up, prices for some of the productions going down, and that would cause some claims in some of the insurance programs that are there. So that could be part of the answer as well.
Thank you, both of you, so much for that detailed answer. We have one final question here, kind of a two-parter, and this comes from Jason and from Christy. So the first part of the question is, this is for Dr. Sauchyn. What should dryland farmers expect for precipitation patterns with a changing climate? And then kind of going along with that, can ranchers access reliable data to integrate into our water development planning for operations? And what are key considerations for ranchers to move this evidence into action?
So the first part was, what can farmers expect in terms of precipitation patterns?
Yeah, specifically for dryland farmers.
Right. And in fact, we do a lot of research on that. We have to use climate models because we have no observations for the future. We have no data for the future. So our only option is to use these models that simulate the climate. And we use a lot of models because we don't know which model is correct. We're projecting conditions in the future, and we don't have a crystal ball. So because we can't possibly know the future, we use a lot of models and look to see where they agree and disagree. And when we project future precipitation and soil moisture of the future, the natural cycles are still there. So the actual difficulty we have in projecting future precipitation patterns isn't so much understanding climate change, it's understanding the natural variability of our climate. That is the biggest source of uncertainty, is that we have such an extremely variable climate to begin with, one of the most variable climates on Earth in terms of precipitation from year to year. And then that volatility is being amplified by a warming climate. And so we can't possibly know what the precipitation patterns will be, but we can look at the trends, and we can say that we can expect an increasing range between the driest and wettest years, such that we could have some exceptionally wet years in the future, when at the same time we still get droughts.
Thank you so much, David. Okay, so I think we are going to conclude the webinar here. I want to thank both David and Matthew for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you for everyone who joined, for your time and for your participation today. You will receive a post-event survey as well as a link to the webinar recording. And if you know anyone that couldn't join live but was registered, they will also be receiving the recording if they would like to watch the webinar. If you're interested in staying up to date with the Simpson Center, you can visit our website where you can subscribe to hear more about upcoming events such as our webinars and receive our monthly newsletter. So again, I would like to thank David and Matthew and for everyone for joining us today. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.